In James 1:19-25, James talks to us about two related themes. The first is anger. Understand this, my dear brothers and sisters, you must all be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to get angry. Human anger doesn't produce the righteousness God desires, so get rid of all the filth and evil in your lives. Humbly accept the word God has planted in your hearts, for it has the power to save your souls. So James talks about anger, but I really think what he wants to get at is the first principle that he wants to present to us about God's word. The first thing he says is accept God's word. Literally, receive God's word. James is very interested that we develop an ability to capture God's word so that it can have its effect in us. He calls it a seed that's planted in our hearts. That seed grows. But for it to grow, we first of all have to receive it. How do you receive God's word? Whether that's by listening or by reading. We need to systematically, in a disciplined way, study God's word. The second thing that he says, starting in verse 22, but don't just listen to God's word. You must do what it says. Otherwise, you're only fooling yourselves, for if you listen to the word and don't obey, it's like glancing at your face in a mirror. You see yourself, you walk away, and you forget what you look like. But if you look carefully into the perfect law that sets you free, if you do what it says and don't forget what you heard, then God will bless you for doing it. We receive God's word, then we obey God's word. James says that if we don't obey God's word, it's like looking in a mirror and then just forgetting about it, just ignoring what we saw in the mirror. If we saw a dirty face, we leave it dirty. That's not the purpose of a mirror. That's not the purpose of God's word. James talks about the law. He says the law exists to set you free. Freedom from sin, freedom from the worries that assail us. What James says is receive God's word and then do what God's word tells you to do so that you can have a better life than the one you currently have.